You're 13 years old. Your hands are trembling as servants tighten the silk ribbons on your wedding gown. The fabric feels suffocating against your chest. You've been told this is the greatest day of your life. They're lying. In the stone chamber beyond your door, 30 aristocrats are already gathering. They're not here to celebrate. They're here to watch. And what they're about to witness isn't a wedding night. It's a ritual, a break, a ceremony designed centuries ago by French nobility to ensure one thing: that you understand your place, that you never forget what you are. Property. This isn't folklore. This isn't an exaggeration. This is the ritual of droit du seigneur and its most disturbing evolution, the witnessed consummation. A practice so vile, so normalized in the courts of medieval and Renaissance France, that it was recorded in legal documents, defended by theologians, and carried out with the full protection of crown and church. Tonight, we're entering a world that history tried to erase. A world where young girls became commodities in elaborate power structures, where virginity wasn't sacred. It was a social contract enforced through public violation, where witnesses didn't intervene. They validated. You think you know what wedding nights were like in medieval times? You don't, because what happened behind those chateau walls wasn't just consummation. It was a theater, cruelty dressed as a ceremony, violence draped in tradition. France, 13th through 17th centuries, an era we romanticize in films and novels. Grand balls, elegant gowns, chivalrous knights. But beneath the silk and ceremony existed a machinery of control that turned young women into instruments of dynastic ambition. Marriage among the French aristocracy wasn't about love. It was a transaction, alliance, the merger of bloodlines and estates. And like any high-stakes contract, it required verification, proof of consummation, evidence that the bride's virginity had been transferred to her husband, that the marriage was legally binding, that future heirs would be legitimate. But French nobility took this verification to an extreme that other European courts found disturbing. They didn't just require proof. They required witnesses, not one or two symbolic observers standing outside the door. No, in many noble houses, especially among the highest ranks, the wedding night became a spectacle. Imagine yourself again in that young bride's position. You're dressed in white. Symbolic, they tell you. Pure. You're led down torchlit corridors by women who won't meet your eyes. They know what's coming. You don't. Not fully. You've been told you have duties. You've been prepared with vague euphemisms about obedience and submission. But no one told you about the audience. The bedchamber door is open. Your breath stops. The room is filled with people. Not just your husband. 30, sometimes 40 aristocrats. Uncles, cousins, bishops, ladies of the court. They stand in a semicircle around an enormous canopied bed. Candles everywhere. The air is thick with perfume and wine. They're dressed in their finest evening clothes. Some are holding goblets. Others are seated on cushioned chairs arranged specifically for viewing. This isn't a private moment. This is a performance. And you're the unwilling star. Your husband, often twice or three times your age, a man you met perhaps once or twice before today, takes your hand. His grip is firm, possessive. He leads you toward the bed. The crowd parts. Someone makes a toast. Laughter echoes off the stone walls. You're shaking so violently you can barely walk. The legal theory behind this horror was straightforward. Marriage contracts among nobility involved enormous transfers of land, titles, and wealth. Any dispute about consummation could invalidate the entire agreement. Therefore, witnesses were required to confirm that the marriage was completed, that the bride's virginity was taken, that the union was binding before God and crown. But theory and practice were oceans apart. Before we go further into this disturbing night, if this kind of hidden history is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed. We're uncovering the stories they erase from textbooks, the rituals they don't teach in schools. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what dark historical topic you want explored next, because there's so much more they never told you. Now, let's return to that chamber, to that night, to what happened when those doors closed, but the audience remained. The witnesses don't just observe passively. They participate, not physically, that would cross even their warped sense of propriety. But verbally, psychologically, they create an atmosphere that turns violation into validation. As the bride is led to the bed, noble women offer encouragement. They speak in coded language about duty and honor, about how this pain is temporary, but the alliance is eternal, about how she should be grateful. Grateful. That word echoes in her ears as her husband begins removing her clothing. In front of everyone, the men drink. They joke among themselves in low voices. Sometimes they offer crude advice to the groom. Sometimes they simply watch in silence, their presence alone a form of enforcement. The message is clear. This is normal. This is expected. This is how noble marriages work. You're on the bed now. Your body is rigid with terror. Your mind is screaming for escape, but there is none. The doors are guarded. Your family negotiated this contract. The church blessed this union. The king's law protects what's about to happen. Every institution that claims to protect you has instead delivered you here. Your husband is patient, not out of kindness, out of performance. He wants the witnesses to see his control, his authority. He undresses you slowly, methodically, as if unwrapping a purchased object. Because that's what you are at this moment. A commodity being inspected for quality. The pain, when it comes, is compounded by the audience. You can't scream. That would be unseemly. You can't fight. That would dishonor your family. You can't even weep loudly. So you bite your lip until it bleeds and stare at the canopy above, trying to disconnect your mind from your body. Try to pretend you're somewhere else. Anywhere else. But you can't escape the sounds. The murmurs of approval from the witnesses. The scratch of a quill on parchment as a clerk documents the event. The clink of goblets as someone proposes another toast. They're celebrating your destruction. The worst part isn't the physical violation. The body can dissociate. The mind can fracture and drift away. But the psychological architecture of this ritual is designed specifically to prevent escape, to ensure that you remain present for your own breaking. The witnesses serve a dual purpose. Legally, they verify consummation. Psychologically, they destroy any possibility of privacy, of intimacy, of humanity. They transform what could be a private trauma into a public exhibition. They ensure you understand that your body is not your own. Not anymore. Perhaps it never was. In some noble houses, the ritual went even further. The bedsheets would be inspected afterward for blood, not just by the witnesses in the room, but displayed to additional family members waiting outside. In extreme cases, bloodied sheets were hung from windows or paraded through chateau halls as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's legitimacy. This wasn't symbolic. It was evidentiary, like a signed contract, like a bill of sale. Historical records from French archives reveal the meticulous documentation of these events. Notaries would be present, recording details, the time of consummation, the witnesses present, any complications. These documents were filed with marriage contracts and property transfers. They had legal weight. They could be referenced in future disputes over inheritance or legitimacy. The church, which you might expect to oppose such practices, was often complicit. Bishops and priests served as witnesses. They provided theological justification. They argued that since marriage was a sacrament and consummation completed the sacrament, witnessing served a holy purpose. It prevented fraud. It ensured the sanctity of a union. But let's be clear about what this really was. This was institutional abuse. This was systematic exploitation of young girls who had no legal rights, no bodily autonomy, no voice. This was a power structure so entrenched that it operated openly, documented itself proudly, and faced virtually no opposition for centuries. You're still on that bed. Time is fractured. Minutes feel like hours. Your husband has finished. He rises, adjusts his clothing, and turns to the witnesses. There's a moment, brief but unmistakable, where he receives their acknowledgement. Nods, murmurs of approval. He's performed his duty, claimed his property, proven his authority. You're left there, bleeding, shaking, trying to understand how this is legal, how this is holy, how this is love. The witnesses don't leave immediately. They linger. The women approach the bed. Some offer comfort, hollow, patronizing comfort that blames you for your own suffering. The first time is always difficult, dear. You'll grow accustomed to it. Think of the children you'll bear. Others inspect. They look for blood on the sheets. They examine you like livestock. One elderly duchess actually lifts the fabric to check, to verify. You close your eyes. You're not a person anymore. You're evidence. The men congratulate your husband. They toast to heirs, to the alliance, to the continued strength of their bloodline. They're already moving on to other concerns, to politics, to hunt plans for tomorrow. You were tonight's entertainment, a brief diversion between more important matters. Eventually, they leave. The doors close. You're alone with your husband. He doesn't comfort you. Why would he? This is normal to him. He was likely raised watching similar rituals performed on his sisters, his cousins. He'll expect this submission regularly, not just sexually, but in all aspects of your life. Tonight was merely the initiation. You lie there in the darkness, listening to your own breathing. Your mind is trying to process what happened but can't. The betrayal is too complete. Your parents negotiated this. Your family celebrated this. The church blessed this. The law protected this. The aristocracy witnessed this. There's nowhere to go. No authority to appeal to. No justice system that recognizes your suffering as suffering. In the morning, you'll be expected to smile, to play the dutiful wife, to pretend that last night was beautiful, romantic, the beginning of your happily ever after. And here's the most disturbing part. This wasn't rare. This wasn't an isolated practice carried out by a few sadistic families. This was standard procedure among the highest levels of French nobility for hundreds of years. Court records from the Valois and Bourbon dynasties contain numerous references to witness consummations. Letters between noble families discuss the practice casually, debating how many witnesses are appropriate, whether clergy should always be present, how to handle situations where the bride proves difficult. The word appears frequently in these documents. Difficult, meaning resistant, meaning traumatized, meaning human. Some historians have tried to downplay this practice. They argue it was ceremonial, that witnesses didn't actually watch the sexual act, but merely blessed the bed beforehand. These historians are wrong. Primary sources are explicit. Witness testimonies in legal disputes describe what they saw in graphic detail. Noble women's private letters discuss the trauma with haunting clarity. This is the history they don't want taught. The history that makes us uncomfortable because it forces us to confront how recently human rights actually emerged. If you're still watching, if you want us to keep digging into these erased stories, do two things. Leave a comment with your reaction to this, and make sure you're subscribed. These investigations take time and research, and your support makes them possible. Now, let's talk about how this system finally started to crumble and why it took so long. The practice of witnessing consummation began declining in the 17th century, not because society suddenly developed empathy, but because power structure shifted. The rise of Enlightenment philosophy questioned traditional authority. The growing middle class challenged aristocratic privileges. Most importantly, women slowly, painfully, began to gain minimal legal recognition. But the decline was gradual, regional, uneven. In some rural, noble houses, witness consummations continued into the 18th century. In others, the practice evolved into less overtly traumatic forms. Witnesses would wait outside the door or inspect sheets afterward without watching the act itself. Progress, they called it, as if waiting outside the door while a child is raped makes it acceptable. The French Revolution of 1789 finally shattered the legal framework that protected these practices. The aristocracy that perpetuated this system lost their heads, literally, to the guillotine. Their chateaux were seized. Their legal privileges were abolished. Their carefully documented archives of witness consummations became evidence of their depravity. But here's what haunts me as a researcher. This system operated for centuries. Thousands of young girls experienced what we've described tonight, and almost none of their individual stories survived. We have the legal documents. We have the procedural descriptions, but we don't have their voices, their names, their testimony in their own words. History erased them twice. First through the ritual itself, which stripped them of personhood and reduced them to contractual instruments. Then through time, which preserved the institutional records but discarded the human suffering. Think about that for a moment. We know the exact legal procedures. We know how many witnesses were required. We know what documents needed to be filed. We know which noble families practiced the most extreme versions. But we don't know the name of a single bride who screamed into her pillow while aristocrats sipped wine and watched her child end. That erasure is intentional. The system wasn't just cruel, it was sophisticated in its cruelty. It created mechanisms to ensure that victims couldn't speak, couldn't organize, couldn't even articulate their trauma in ways that society would recognize as legitimate complaints. When noble women in the 18th century began writing privately about their wedding nights, they used coded language. They described feeling overwhelmed or frightened or unprepared. They never said rape. They never said torture, because the vocabulary to describe their experience as criminals didn't exist. The law defined their wedding night as lawful, regardless of their consent, regardless of their age, regardless of the audience. Language itself was weaponized against them. Modern researchers studying this phenomenon face ethical challenges. How do you write about institutional child abuse without sensationalizing it? How do you honor victims whose names you'll never know? How do you balance historical accuracy with respect for trauma? But we have to write about it, because the alternative is allowing this practice to remain erased, allowing the sanitized version of aristocratic history to persist, allowing people to romanticize an era that was, for many young girls, a living nightmare. France wasn't alone in employing witness consummations, though French nobility took the practice to its most extreme form. Medieval England had sporadic cases, usually involving royalty where succession was contested. Spanish nobility occasionally used witnesses for strategic marriages. Russian aristocracy adopted similar practices in the 16th century, likely influenced by French customs. But the French systematized it. They created protocols. They trained notaries specifically for this documentation. They built entire legal frameworks around verification of consummation. They turned individual cruelty into institutional procedure. And that's the lesson that extends beyond this specific practice. Institutions don't accidentally create systems of abuse. They design them. They refine them. They defend them. They train new generations to perpetuate them. The witness consummation ritual didn't happen because individual nobles were sadistic, though many were. It happened because the aristocratic power structure needed mechanisms to control women's bodies, enforce property transfers, and maintain bloodline legitimacy. The ritual served the system. The system protected the ritual, and young girls paid the price. What happened to these brides afterward? The psychological literature on historical trauma is limited, but we can extrapolate from what we know about modern survivors of public sexual violence. Many likely developed what we now recognize as complex PTSD. They would have experienced recurring nightmares, dissociation, hypervigilance. They would have struggled with intimacy throughout their lives, associating physical touch with that initial trauma. They would have transmitted that trauma, often unconsciously, to their daughters. Some historical records hint at this. Noble women's letters occasionally mention daughters who were melancholic or nervous or prone to fits. These descriptions might be evidence of anxiety disorders or depression stemming from wedding night trauma. But again, the vocabulary didn't exist to make those connections explicit. A few women found ways to resist. Court records mention brides who refused to enter the bedchamber, who fought against witnesses, who fled their marriages afterward. These women were punished. Legally, they had abandoned their marital duties. Socially, they had dishonored their families. Some were forcibly returned to their husbands. Others were confined to convents, not as nuns, but as permanent prisoners. Resistance was possible, but rarely successful. The system was too complete. The consequences are too severe. Here's where this history becomes uncomfortably relevant to our present. The witness consummation ritual ended, but the underlying power structure, The idea that women's bodies are subject to public verification, that sexuality requires institutional oversight, that intimacy is a matter of legal documentation, that structure persists in different forms. Think about modern debates over reproductive rights, over bodily autonomy, over who controls access to medical care, to contraception, to abortion. These aren't new conflicts. They're the same power struggle that created the witnessed consummation ritual, just updated for contemporary politics. The specifics change. The underlying dynamic remains. Institutions still claim authority over women's bodies. Laws still regulate intimate decisions. Society still treats female sexuality as something requiring oversight, verification, control. We're not comparing modern reproductive health care to medieval rape rituals. That would be absurd. But we are recognizing the common thread, the persistent belief, embedded in legal and religious structures, that women's bodies are public concern rather than private sovereignty. You came here tonight for dark history, for the disturbing stories they don't teach in schools. And you got that. But more importantly, you got context. You got the machinery behind the cruelty. You got the understanding that this wasn't ancient history perpetrated by incomprehensible monsters. This was sophisticated, educated people creating systems of abuse and defending them with law, theology, and tradition. That's the horror that should keep us awake, not the individual acts of violence, though those are nightmarish enough, but the social structures that normalized, legalized, and perpetuated those acts across generations. The young bride we followed through this narrative, she's a composite of thousands of real girls whose names we'll never know, who suffered in documented silence, whose trauma was filed away in aristocratic archives as procedural verification. They didn't get justice. Many didn't survive long. Childbirth complications, untreated infections, suicide, all were common among young noble wives. And when they died, their husbands remarried quickly. The cycle continued. But their suffering isn't meaningless if we remember it accurately. If we refuse the sanitized version of history. If we acknowledge what was done to them, why it was done, and how long it took for humanity to recognize it as wrong. That recognition is shockingly recent. The legal concept of marital rape, the idea that a husband can sexually assault his wife, wasn't recognized in France until 1990. 1990. Think about that. For most of human history, what happened to that 13-year-old bride wasn't just legal. It was definitional. It was what marriage meant. We've made progress, but the progress is fragile, built on legal and social changes that could be reversed if we're not vigilant, built on recognition of bodily autonomy that previous generations rejected. So yes, this was a story about a horrifying ritual from medieval France. But it's also a story about power, about how institutions protect themselves by normalizing abuse, about how tradition is often just a prettier word for systematic cruelty, about how long it takes for humanity to recognize suffering that's been hiding in plain sight. The witness consummation ritual ended. The power structure that created it continues in evolved forms. And the question we should leave with isn't just, how could they do that? But what are we currently normalizing that future generations will look back on with the same horror? Because they will look back. They'll study our era. They'll examine our legal codes and social practices. They'll ask how we could have been so blind, so cruel, so sophisticated in our justifications for institutional harm. And they'll be right to ask, if this investigation into erased history resonated with you, if it disturbed you, challenged you, made you think differently about the past, then consider subscribing if you haven't already. We're building a community that refuses the sanitized version of history, that demands the full truth, no matter how dark. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What shocked you most? What historical practice should we investigate next? Your engagement shapes what we research, what stories we tell, what truths we uncover. And if you made it this far without subscribing, what are you waiting for? Hit that button. Join us in the uncomfortable work of honest history. Until next time, remember, the past is darker than they taught you. And understanding that darkness is the first step toward ensuring it stays in the past.